I wrote this book now because I felt like I was having the same conversation over and over again. I get, invited by local governments, enforcement bodies, regulators, and a lot of them want to do something about the outsized power of tech companies, but they often don't know where to start. Or I also sense on the part of governments a sort of fatigue or lack of ideas of how to actually have a big impact. But the more I started to dive into the role of technology, going from a sector to really a layer touching all aspects of our lives, the more I realized that the problem is not only disinformation or not only mental health of teenagers or antitrust or cybersecurity, but there's a real challenge with who gets to decide and, in essence, who has power over our digital lives. When we look over the past decades, there has been a tendency by Democrat-led, Republican-led governments, especially in the US, to choose a hands-off approach to tech regulation, really to trust market forces and also to trust the technology itself. This whole promise that putting people online, giving them mobile phones, or allowing their mobile phone use and social media use to just have its democratizing magical impact was long a belief that was held. And so as a result, there's a lack of guardrails, a lack of regulation, a lack of laws, a lack of insights, a lack of agency, really. And that leads to a lack of accountability. So very often companies can get away with a whole bunch of risk taking or harms because there are no rules that they officially have to abide by. And as a result, there's, impunity with which they handle things. And there's a lack of accountability, a lack of redress for people, but also really a lack of liability on the part of any company for what is happening to our societies. The Tech Coup is a provocative title. It really talks about this power shift away from the public, more into private hands. It talks about an accountability gap. But it is not a book that is against technology. I am myself curious, excited, and interested in technology. I just think the problem is that too often companies, big but also small ones, well-known ones, but also the ones that don't have any name recognition with consumers, have really amassed a lot of power. And that can be through the products that they develop. Think about spyware, for example, which by default violates people's privacy by hacking into their devices. Even the most powerful people of this world cannot evade this kind of technology. Spyware has been used against political leaders, but also opposition figures, journalists, judges. That is a very, very aggressive technology made by small companies, even if they're becoming more and more wealthy, that really needs addressing through regulation, and for too long has just been able to grow and proliferate all over the world. And so the idea that that's a statement about any technology is, of course, misguided. It's about specific technologies that hurt our democracy, and the broader trend that the commercial interests and the power by companies has simply gotten too big, gotten out of hand without countervailing powers, is the kind of topics that I touch on in the Tech Coup. The idea that there's a sense of urgency behind writing the Tech Coup is absolutely correct, but readers will not come away depressed and feeling disempowered. There are so many things that can be done, that should be done, to rebalance this imbalance towards greater democratic governance and oversight. And that is what I focus on in the solutions part as well. And so indeed, we have to acknowledge that policy often responds to a changed reality. It's very hard for policies to anticipate what is coming, yet that is what we need when it comes to emerging technologies. AI is now the last wave that has led to new questions of governance and regulation, but it won't be the last. And so I think it is key to start thinking about new ways to anticipate the next wave of an emerging technology, to basically go back to core principles, think about non-discrimination or antitrust or access to information and transparency, to put those principles at the core of a regulatory effort, but to really empower the enforcement bodies, the regulatory bodies, to look for where these principles are at stake in a flexible way. So basically, whether it's AI or the next yet unknown wave of an emerging technology, that the regulators can act without having to wait for very technology specific laws to be adopted, because that will not just be the normal kind of response rate to changing realities. It will become harder and harder to respond to all these emerging technologies because the technologies move very fast, and this regulatory process is really too slow in the face of that, and it will lead to a growing gap between the realities that are unfolding before our eyes and the pace with which policies can catch up. So it's also time to think about innovating governance and innovating democratic policies at the same time. When we look at the bringing to market of new AI applications, there is often the question of, can we delay the moment between an innovation being known or discovered or found and bringing it to market? And right now we see an enormous push, competition, of course, between AI companies that moves in favor of just pushing out new applications into the market without much friction, without much pausing and assessing of the unintended consequences. And so when I was thinking about solutions for this race to market, I thought back to a concept that we know in the EU, which is called the precautionary principle. And the idea behind it, it's actually part of the EU treaty, so it's quite well anchored in law, is that there are maybe some innovations, like GMOs, for example, where the invention itself offers a solution, but there are unknown consequences to a larger ecosystem. So, for example, manipulating a crop may be great for pesticide use or resistance to certain diseases, but we don't know what the spread of it in nature will do to biodiversity or whether it will take over entire crops as we've seen in the past. And so the idea is build in a pause between the innovation being discovered and releasing it into the wild. And while I'm not suggesting to sort of copy the precautionary principle one-on-one to AI and other emerging technologies, I do think that we can learn some lessons about this notion of, if we don't know enough and know enough in the public interest about risks to society or unintended consequences for society, we may need to look at the product or the technology a little bit closer before it can be pushed into the market the way it is right now, where the risks are sort of learned by society as a whole, but not in a constrained way. So that's the idea about looking for solutions within concepts that we know and applying them to the way we treat tech. When we look at big tech companies and how much we depend on their services working well, think about cloud computing, for example, but also cybersecurity companies. Some of them have really become too big to fail, in an analogy to the financial services, where if we are able to put more checks and more oversight and more responsibility to these companies, hopefully there will be fewer incidents, breaches of the kind that we also saw recently with the CrowdStrike incident that happened after I wrote the book. But, you know, the airports being down across the world, databases no longer working. We had an incident in the Netherlands where I am right now this week where the communication systems used by the defense sector were down, and it caused a major systemic crisis. And so the over-reliance on these tech services working well without having the proper obligations, the proper assessments of whether they are actually up to the task, leads to vulnerabilities in the system. And so I think we can borrow from the notion of too big to fail and apply it to tech companies that are critical nodes in our society, and really make sure that there's clarity on their resilience, their responsibility, and their functioning. When I served as a member of European Parliament, which I did for 10 years, there was not a single legislative proposal or regulatory idea or even amendment that would be proposed without going through the legal services. So at some point, independent legal experts would look at these proposals through a legal lens and give feedback. How could the draft legislation be improved so that it would be more legally sound? Were there, unintended gaps that could be abused by those who wanted to object the law? In other words, there was an independent legal service to be tapped into for any member of the European Parliament, no matter what political party. This service was there, non-partial, independent, for their benefit. I believe that the lack of technological expertise is found throughout regulatory bodies, and that makes legislators vulnerable to lobbying anyway. The tech lobby is incredibly powerful. Tech is complicated, and sometimes easy frames are pushed by these tech lobbyists. But to make the work of lawmakers easier and also more informed, I think a Congress in the US or a European Parliament in Brussels would benefit a great deal from having this expert team similar to the legal services, having the tech services, informing lawmakers about how tech works. If they want to solve a problem, how might they go about it, and to offer a more independent but expert view as an alternative to these lobbying narratives that are now so dominant in informing lawmakers. There's a lot of talk about, one, the importance of data, not only when it comes to protection of privacy, but also now as a key ingredient for training large language models for AI applications. So data remains an incredibly central part of both the problem, surveillance capitalism, the outsized power of tech companies because they hoover up so much data. And it is also thought about as part of the solution. Better data protection, but also more data commons or agency for individuals over data. And while I think it is important to explore every possibility to make people more independent and empowered in making decisions about their digital lives, I worry a little bit about the economic lens with which data is often looked at when people talk about solutions of data stewardship and so on. Because again, the power asymmetry between anyone who would have to manage this data for a whole bunch of people and the individual is just so out of step. So I think, as we've seen with a lot of opt-in or opt-out choices, it's hard for people to be fully informed about what the choices before them really are. Companies are really good at optimally designing for people to click yes to just, giving away a whole bunch of their data. So I think the question is, how much can we expect of the individual internet user to make an effort to put into navigating the use of their data? And especially when there are economic incentives, then privacy may become a sort of luxury good instead of a fundamental right. And so I think it's a good direction of solutions to explore. We do have to be mindful again of this power relationship in terms of information, in terms of economic incentives. And from that point of view, I think a lot of questions remain unanswered. When we look at regulating tech, we often see, as the EU has recently done, that scale is a big criterion for imposing more obligations on the biggest platforms, the biggest tech players. And I think that often makes a lot of sense. But another articulation of scale is, of course, capital. And in that sense, it would be easy to distinguish between for-profit companies that are using data and scaling in the interest of shareholder value versus those like Wikipedia that are not for profits and that are much more community-led when it comes to keeping up the pages of information that pretty much everyone around the world is using. And so I do think it's important to appreciate that there might be unintended consequences for a major platform like Wikipedia. But also, if you look at the comparison between, let's say, incentives on the part of a WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, or a Signal that's also not for profit, we can see big differences in the incentives on the part of the platforms or the services, and that should count for something.